Good morning and welcome to Sharper Iron. Spend the next hour with us studying the living and active Word of God. His two-edged sword of law and gospel, recorded for you in Holy Scripture, all about Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended for you. Thanks for tuning in this morning here on Worldwide KFUO, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. I'm your host, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. Sharper Iron is underwritten by the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, where your investments help support the work of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Visit lcef.org for more information. On this Monday, May 20th, we are starting a new series here on Sharper Iron, one that will take us through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. When the Lord sent his people into exile, he also promised that he would deliver them. He began to fulfill that promise during the reign of Cyrus the Persian, whose decree allowed the exiles to start going home. Yet the return of the people of God was fraught with obstacles, political, economic, social, and especially religious. In his mercy, the Lord sent faithful clergy like Ezra and faithful laymen like Nehemiah to aid the people in their return. Today's episode will introduce especially the book of Ezra and study the initial text, Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. To help us sharpen our faith in Christ as we study God's Word today, we have with us returning guest, the Reverend Dr. David Adams. Dr. Adams serves as professor of Exegetical Theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Adams, welcome back to Sharper Iron.
Thank you very much, Tim.
So, Dr. Adams, help us with some historical context, much of which will come up in the text itself. We've been recently studying here on Sharper Iron the book of Daniel. Prior to that, we studied Isaiah 40 to 66. So we've been thinking about the exile, the time right before. Now we're going to start going into the time after. Just give us sort of that large historical context of where we are with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.
All right. Well, you already know about the exile, so I'm not going to mention details there. But there were a series of exiles, right? We tend to think of the event at the destruction of the temple as the exile, but that was the last not even the last, but it was one of a series of conflicts in which God's people were carried into exile. First, some to Assyria, some to Babylon, and they were in Babylon then, as Jeremiah says, for 70 years, from 586. Some prefer 585 as the date. But in 739, Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great. Now, it's worth our knowing a little bit about Cyrus. Cyrus is mentioned several times in the Bible, most especially in the book of Isaiah, where he's identified actually as an anointed one, a Mashiach, one whom God has chosen for a particular task. And in this case, the task was bringing his people back from exile. So Cyrus was technically a Mede, that is to say, Persia's divided into several areas, of course, and Persia is modern Iran mostly. Media is the northwestern part of that, and that's where Cyrus is from. He was originally king of a relatively small city-state there, he went on to conquer all of what was Persia, including defeating his own grandfather in battle. His grandfather was the king of Persia, whom he defeated in order to seize the throne and unify all of what we today think of as Persia, Media, and Persia. So Cyrus had become the ruler of Persia in 559, and then he set about gradually expanding his rule, not originally to Babylon, but to other areas. He extended his kingdom to the east, to basically the border of India, as we think of it, and to the west, he conquered large parts of what we think of as Turkey today, bypassing Babylon and Assyria, and eventually was ready to come to grips with Babylon itself. So together with some allies, he invaded, and according to his account, the Babylonians just simply gave up. That is to say, the Babylonians were not happy with their king Nabonidus, who had actually fled the city, and they surrendered it without a fight, according to the Persian account. Whether that exactly happened or not, we don't know. But in October of 539, Cyrus and his army, and Cyrus was not actually leading the army in that battle, by the way, but in any case, they conquered Babylon. They took control of Babylon, or the Babylonians simply threw open the gates and they marched in. However, the details happened. They ended up controlling Babylon, expelled the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, and then added Babylon to their already extensive kingdom. And Babylon was already in control of Syria. Assyria. And so including conquering Babylon meant conquering Assyria and all of the territory that Babylon controlled at that time. So there were a large number of Jewish exiles living in Babylon. And Cyrus, who by this time had an extensive kingdom, and Cyrus was apparently relatively brilliant as a politician as well as military tactician, and he came up with a unique idea, unique for that time in world history, in the Middle East anyway. And he decided that rather than follow the path that the Assyrians and the Babylonians had done of suppressing, with a heavy hand, the subjugated peoples that he had conquered, he decided that you make more, friends with honey than with whatever it is that you don't like. I forget what that saying goes now. But anyway, he decided that he would adopt a policy that would encourage and allow the various subjugated peoples to return to their land and rule themselves under the overlordship of Persia. So his rule was, the standards of the time, quite benevolent. So he allows not only the Jews to return to what became the Persian province of Yehud, but also many other conquered peoples. And so he records this. We actually have a historical record called the Cyrus Cylinder. It's in the British Museum today, in which Cyrus records his actions. And among them, he tells how he allowed these subjugated peoples to return to their lands and take their gods with them and restore their temples and so forth. And Israel, Judah are not mentioned in the Cyrus Cylinder, but it doesn't give an exhaustive list anyway. It just gives, some examples. Right. So he says, and I'll quote from the English translation, I returned the images of the gods who had resided there, that is in Babylon, to their places, and I let them dwell in their eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. So this was part of Cyrus's political strategy, which worked very well for the Persian Empire for the next several hundred years. Their basic approach was, pay your taxes, don't cause any problems. You can rule yourself according to your own laws for the most part, as long as you don't cause us any problems, and pay your taxes and supply the soldiers that you're supposed to supply, when we insist that we need them, and everything will be all right. So Israel, Judah, Yehud, enters into a several hundred-year period, roughly 200 years, down to 333 when Alexander the Great comes sweeping through and messing everything up. So they enter a period of basically relatively political stability in the Persian Empire. It was a little rocky for the first few decades, as the Jews who moved back were displacing people who had moved in, by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and that caused some local tensions that the Bible talks about in these books. But and that led the Persians to kind of hold things down a bit to calm down the tension, if you will, and then eventually they were allowed to go ahead and build a second temple and so forth. So that's kind of the general historical context of Cyrus's capture of Babylon and his adoption of a political philosophy that allowed people to return to their lands.
So with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, then they start, Ezra, as we'll read here in a moment, starts there with that first year of the reign of Cyrus of Persia. About how far into the Persian Empire in terms of the history, do these two books take us?
Well, the Persian Empire proper, Cyrus is, and here's a little confusion, by the way, in that superscription in the beginning of Ezra. It says the first year of Cyrus's rule. It means the first year of Cyrus's rule over Babylon, not over Persia. Cyrus had become king of Persia 20 years prior. So what it really means, it doesn't say Babylon there, but they're thinking of the Babylonian context. So it was the first year of Cyrus's rule over Babylon. So Persia, there had been obviously political states on the east side of the Zagros Mountains that divide Mesopotamia from Persia. And, those political states had interacted for millennia. But the Persian Empire, as we tend to think of it, began in 559 when Cyrus unified them and continued on until conquered by Alexander the Great in I forget now
it's around,
year of the
around like 336 BC, somewhere in there.
333 is when he goes through Jerusalem, and then continues on for another not quite 10 years. It goes on and conquers. I can't remember now the date of the culminating battle where he eventually defeats the Persians, but it's in the 320s. And then rules. It goes on to try to. The Persians were not happy about being conquered by the Greeks, and so they continued to, have little local revolts and other people trying to fight against the Greeks as well, tried to assist them. So there was an ongoing period of conflict there, that lasted throughout, throughout Alexander's life and beyond. So the Persian, but basically we would say the Persian Empire ended in the 320s when Alexander the Great conquered it.
Sure, and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah then don't take us all that far, though. They go till sometime in the 400s BC, about. It's a little vague. The Nehemiah becomes the governor of Yehud in about 444, and is the governor there for a period of time, and then kind of goes on leave or somehow goes back to Persia for a short time and then returns. And the book of Nehemiah ends in roughly the year 432. So about halfway through the history of the Persian Empire. Right? If we think of, even if we think of 539 as the starting point and say 330 as the ending point, roughly, 430 is about halfway in between 432. So sometime after 432, Nehemiah ends. We don't know exactly 432, 431, 430, somewhere in there. And obviously Ezra ends before that. Right. So with Ezra and Nehemiah then, and especially as we look at the first chapter of Ezra this morning, what kinds of events, what kind of timeline are we talking about for the book itself and the events recorded? It seems like we're going to get some of it, which is history that's being recorded, and then some of it that Ezra and Nehemiah themselves are actually living and interacting with.
Yes, that's right. So what happens is, they return, and there's a major group that returns in the first wave, and according to I forget I can't remember which verse it is. It's in chapter 2 of Ezra. there are 46,000 Israelites who return in that first wave, and the exact number is actually given in the book of Ezra, and I can't lay my mind on it because I'm old and senile. But in any case, some 46,000 people return in the first wave. And then the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra tell about events between the return and the time that Ezra himself comes. Ezra doesn't come to Judah until 458, probably 458. So there's a period there of 80 years between the return from the exile and the time that Ezra comes, and another 12, 13 years until the time that Nehemiah comes. So Ezra, the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra are all, in a sense, background to the story of Ezra. So he gives the events that, the most important events that happened in those 80 years between the return of the first group and Ezra himself coming.
So
and that's chapters 1 to 6.
Okay, so in chapters 1 to 6, you have the time period from, again, when Cyrus conquers Babylon up to the point of Ezra when he himself enters the scene in chapter 7. And just kind of looking at those first 6 chapters, it seems the key events are the return of that large group of exiles at the outset, and then the work that went into rebuilding the temple, or those pretty much cover the first 6 chapters of the big things that happen?
Yeah, chapter 2 is pretty much basically all about the return, list of people and descriptions of them, and and the events and so forth. So chapter 2 is basically about the return. Chapter 3 takes up the initial attempt to rebuild the temple, starting with the altar and the temple building, and this raises hostility among Israel's neighbors. They don't, they don't like the fact that the Judahites have come back and have dispossessed them from the lands they've been living on for the last 70 years. Right. So, and they're concerned also about whether, this will cause political problems, whether there'll be conflict between, the Jews who returned and the people who live around them. Sounds a little like today. But in any case, they write to Artaxerxes, the Persian king who had succeeded. Cyrus died, I think, if I remember right, in 330. So he didn't live tremendously long after defeating Babylon. He was succeeded by, actually, initially his son Cambyses, and then a couple of others who ruled there. So the adversaries write to the Persian king and get him to order them to stop building the temple, which he does because they're not looking. The Persians don't want trouble. That's their main concern, right? They want everybody to behave themselves and live in peace. So the king orders the building of the temple stopped, and the Jews comply with that. And things sit there for a while. Actually, this takes us into the prophetic books of Haggai and Zechariah, that deal with that. But in any case, after a period of time, the rebuilding of the temple begins. Basically, leaders of the Jewish community write to the Persian king, and they look through their archives. Chapter 6 tells us about this. They look through their archives and discover the decree of the decree of Cyrus, and they say, okay, no, they have a right to do this, so we're going to allow. So we're going to allow them to continue to build the temple. So the king at the time writes back, and he says, you can finish building the temple. And so the rest of chapter 6 is taken up then with the building of the temple and its dedication. So yeah, basically chapter 2 about the return, chapter 3 and 4 about the first attempt to build the temple that they have to stop, and then chapters 5 and 6 about the completion of the things related to the completion of the temple.
So, and then after that, that's when we come to the portion of the book where Ezra himself enters the scene, and that's what I think you mentioned, the 450s, 440s BC. What's the situation there that the rest of the book then covers?
Well, excuse me, Ezra was appointed to some official capacity, and the term that's used is a Persian term, and it's a little vague. We probably should think of it as not so much really the governor. He was more like the troubleshooter, the personal representative of the king who's going to oversee Jewish affairs. So maybe, we might have some title today like, executive assistant for Jewish affairs, or some minister for Jewish affairs, something like that. But anyway, he travels back then in chapter 7 with authority from the Persian king to oversee the affairs of the people, not to govern, but to kind of troubleshoot and make sure everything goes well. Yeah. And then in chapter 7, we get that account. We also get in chapter 8 the list of all the people who come back with Ezra as well, including Levites, because if we look at the list of people who returned initially, there weren't many Levites. Right. For some reason, the tribe of Levi didn't come rushing back after the exile as much as people from other tribes did, or mostly Judahites, of course. So there was a little bit of a shortage of Levites. And so Ezra actually encourages Levites to come back in this second wave. It's usually referred to as the second wave, and then the third wave of returnees, at the time of Nehemiah. That's probably a little simplistic. Probably there were, small groups trickling back all the time, because there was a lot of communication back and forth between Yehud in Jerusalem and the Persian, centers of power to the east. So, there was regular communication back and forth. They knew what was going on. The people in Yehud knew what was going on back in Persia, and vice versa. So there were probably small groups of people moving, probably both ways, to be honest, but especially, coming back. But we get a group of Levites who return, and then the rest of chapter 8 is given over to their celebration of their return, and the accounts connected to their arrival in Jerusalem. And then chapters 9 and 10, the last two chapters in the book, take up the problem of intermarriage, this major reform that Ezra needs to undertake. So the last two chapters deal specifically with that problem, as the kind of indicative situation that is troubling the life of God's people. And so we get the last two chapters dedicated with that. And then the book ends. And the book ends in a rather abrupt fashion. The people agree to terminate the practice of intermarriage. And we get a list at the end of chapter 10 of those who had engaged in intermarriage with non-Israelites. And then the book ends. So Ezra's ministry, Ezra's work goes on, and he shows up then in the book of Nehemiah as well. So the book just kind of ends at somewhat of an artificial point. And that probably takes us to another background kind of issue, and that's the relationship between the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Sure. We got about 2 minutes here before we go to a break, Dr. Adams. So talk a little bit about that. We don't have to get into all of the things that happen in Nehemiah, but if you can just kind of give us the connection between the two, or deal with that a little bit, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. Well, the main thing to know is that in Jewish tradition, and this goes back to the Babylonian Talmud, in Jewish tradition, we're told that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles were all written by Ezra himself. Today, that's not widely accepted. But it is clear that in Jewish tradition, they were regarded as one continuous work. And there's a lot of truth to that. The book of Ezra, in a sense, picks up where Chronicles leaves off. And Nehemiah, there's a gap again between, a chronological gap between Ezra and Nehemiah, but it does continue the story. So Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah constitute the third historical epic in the Old Testament. We've got the first historical epic, the Pentateuch, and then we've got the second historical epic, which, is the former prophets, as we describe them, that tell the story of the settlement to the exile. And then the third historical epic, Chronicles, actually goes all the way back to creation and summarizes things, but dealing primarily with the events of the post-exilic period.
Okay, so we've got that third main historical epic of the Old Testament. We're going to pick up with that thought more on the other side of the break. You're listening to Sharper Iron on KFUO. We're talking to Dr. David Adams this morning. We'll be right back. Please stick around.
Did you know that an investment with Lutheran Church Extension Fund exclusively supports LCMS ministries and church workers? That's right. LCEF ensures LCMS churches, schools, and organizations have access to the financial resources they need to sustain, strengthen, and start ministry work. In other words, you can feel good investing with LCEF because we share your Lutheran values and love for the church. Learn more at lcef.org. LCF is a nonprofit religious organization. Therefore, LCF investments are not FDIC-insured bank deposit accounts. This is not an offer to sell investments or solicitation to buy. LCF will offer and sell its securities only in states where authorized. The offer is made solely by LCF's offering circular. Investors should carefully read the offering circular, which more fully describes associated risks.
Welcome back to Sharper Iron. It is Monday, May 20th. We're studying Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 11 with Dr. David Adams. He serves as professor of Exegetical Theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Adams, prior to the break, you were describing the relationship between Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as Chronicles before that, and you described it as the third main historical epic in the Old Testament. For my experience, both as an individual Christian and as a pastor, this is one of the more neglected spots of the Old Testament when it comes to our historical knowledge of it and our knowledge of it in general. We often have an idea, okay, there's Noah, there's Abraham, there's Moses, we know Samson probably from Judges, and we know David, and then maybe we know a little bit about the divided kingdom and the exile. But this time, Ezra and Nehemiah just seems to be neglected. Why do you think that is, and why shouldn't it be?
Well, I think there are two factors that come into play here. One is probably historical with a small h, and the other more theological. So the historical reason is that in the Western world, in Europe and in North America, there has been, until maybe the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a profound neglect of the history of the Persian Empire in Europe. The Europeans in the 19th century were very pro-Greek. Okay, the Europeans of the 19th century loved the Greeks, and they accepted the Greek view of things, namely that the Greeks were great and the Persians were terrible. And so, as a result, European historians, European students of that part of the world, just basically ignored the Persian period, almost as if it didn't exist, except to celebrate the Greek win at Thermopylae and other places like that. So there is a historical bias in the West that continues to this very day. They're in the popular mind, a little bit of the attitude that we see in Europe and here in America, kind of I'll be frank here, the anti-Arab attitude that Americans and Europeans have toward people in the Middle East. There's a historical reason for that, and that also contributes to why this part of the Bible is not studied as much. We just don't care about the Persian period in general, historically. Now, the second factor, the theological factor, is much more important. And I think here the reason that Christians tend not to focus on these books very much, or even this period very, very much, is that it's less explicitly messianic. That is to say, if you think about messianic prophecies and passages that there's very little explicit messianic stuff in these books. So there is some. I'm not saying there's not any, but relatively speaking, we pay most attention to two things: the Psalms, because of their devotional value, and those parts of the Old Testament that are most obviously messianic. And we ignore those parts of the Old Testament that are less obviously messianic. Now, that's partly our problem for not understanding the way the messianic message of the Old Testament is communicated. So that's a little bit of a theological reflection on us, but that's probably the reason why that Christians just don't pay that much attention. A little bit of history, a little bit of theology coming together.
So with that, then especially the theological point that these books, at least to us, seem less specifically messianic. How do these books proclaim to us Christ?
Right. First, the kind of the overall theme, if there is a single theme that kind of unites all the post-exilic history, Ezra and Nehemiah Chronicles, it's the desire to affirm the fact that Israel remains the people of God, and the promises that God gave to their forefathers are still good. That is to say, that they are the heirs of God's promises. This is the main thing that Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah want to get across. Okay? In Missouri Synod Lutherans, if they know the history of their own church body, should resonate with this. They should think of the time, after the Saxon settlers came and settled in the southern part of Missouri, and their chief, Martin Stephan, was expelled from the community for moral problems and some theological problems as well. And after that, there was a lot of angst among the community about whether they were still the church or not. Could they still be the church? After their leader, whom they had elevated in honor and respected and had been so influential, if he was no more and they were no longer under the authority of the bishop, were they actually church? And that's kind of the question that the Israelites were asking, right? God had sent them into exile. They no longer have a Davidic king on the throne. They no longer have all the lands that God had promised them. They have a very small area of Judah and Benjamin, and a little bit of extending further north than that, but a relatively small area that they had control of, the Persian province of Yehud. And so they had anxiety about whether or not they really were still the people of God, and did God's promises still apply to them. So that's the main theological issue that breaches the whole of Ezra and Nehemiah Chronicles. There are some secondary issues as well, like the need for kind of constant reform, the struggle against the tendency to settle down and be comfortable and conform to the ways of the world. And that's a theme that emerges. The problem of intermarriage, the compromise that it introduces is part of that. And by the way, that same crisis shows up again in the book of Nehemiah. And it's helpful to think about the other times where intermarriage has gotten the Israelites in problems, right? So when they first even before they settle in the land, when they're getting ready to cross over under Joshua for the first time. In that year or so, when they were settled, when they were in the plains of Moab, the Israelites began to intermarry with some of the Canaanites, and that led to apostasy there. And then later on, we get Solomon intermarrying with all of his foreign wives and his apostasy, and Solomon sets up all these temples for the worship of gods other than Israel's gods, and really opens the door to all the apostasy that follows after that. And then after the division of the kingdom in the northern kingdom, we have King Omri, who marries his son Ahab to a Canaanite princess, Jezebel, who comes down from the north, from what we would think of as Lebanon today. And she brings an aggressive commitment to Baal worship with her. And she and Ahab established Baal worship as the kind of the state religion of the northern kingdom. So several times in Israel's past, this intermarriage with non-Israelites has led to major spiritual crises. And it continues to be a problem in the post-exilic period. So that question of the constant need of reform, the need to resist the temptation to settle down and be comfortable with the world, and that intermarriage is part of that. So those are all important things. But the most important thing when it comes to preaching Christ, and it comes to seeing how the messianic trajectory of the Old Testament unfolds, the most important thing is the way in which these books communicate how God was at work in, with, and under the events of history, what appear to us to be secular history, to bring about the coming of the Messiah, and through him the restoration of the fallen world. So the Old Testament is, we like to say that Christ is the center of the Old Testament. And often we implement that by only looking at the parts of the Old Testament that are most obviously messianic or Christological. But when we talk about Christ as the center of the Old Testament, what we're really wanting to emphasize, or what we need to remember, is that the whole trajectory of Israel's history leads to Christ. So in a sense, everything that God is doing, it's not messianic prophecy, but it is messianic trajectory. And that's the case here. So rather like another book from the same period, the book of Esther, right? God is not seen acting on the front of the stage, if you will, in the book of Esther. He acts behind the stage through the events that are going on in what we might think of as secular history. The same thing is kind of true in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. There is certainly an emphasis on the promises that God gives to David and to Solomon in Chronicles in particular. But for Ezra and Nehemiah, for those books particularly, they're a little more like Esther in that God is not, center stage. He's behind the curtain directing the events that are going to lead to Christ. And so, if we think about communicating the Christology, or I should say the Christocentricity of these books, we should remember that Jesus is the culmination of the history that's unfolding in Ezra and Nehemiah. Everything that happens is going to lead to Jesus coming, even if it's not spoken of prophetically directly. The other thing that is another thing that's important theologically and Christologically in these books is the recognition that the faithfulness of the promises of God. And this gets back to what the Israelites were concerned about. Were they still the people of God? Well, the answer is yes, they were still the people of God, because as Paul says to the Romans, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. And the promises that God made to Abraham, to David, to the Israelites in times past were still promises that applied to them as he was at work in their history as well to unfold the events that are going to lead to Christ. So another way in which the Christocentricity of these books can be proclaimed is by highlighting the faithfulness of the promises of God, and how the events that happen in these books underscore the fact that God was still at work through them. Even if he wasn't occupying center stage, as it were, if he were directing things from behind the curtain, he is still at work. And the drama that's unfolding on the stage of history is still the drama of God's redemptive history leading to Christ.
That's
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just say that's all very helpful, Dr. Adams. If you have one more comment, that's great. I was going to go ahead and read the text here pretty quick too.
Yep. Let's go ahead and jump into the text.
All right. So this is Ezra chapter 1. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus king of Persia brought these out in the charge of Mithridath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. That's our text, Ezra chapter 1. So, Dr. Adams, as the text there begins, again, we noted the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, is the first year when he conquered Babylon. So we're in 539, 538 BC, right around there. The book notes that this is to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Jeremiah had specifically prophesied that after 70 years, Israel would, the people who had been taken into exile, the Judahites, that their exile would end and God would restore them to the land. So that's the reference that is, being alluded to there. So,
and that would be an example of what you were talking about. One of the overarching themes, we see the faithfulness of God to his promises, particularly this one that he made through the prophet Jeremiah. He's being faithful to fulfill. Another theme that you mentioned is also prominent in this verse, where it says, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. So, earlier you were talking about the Cyrus cylinder and Cyrus's kind of foreign policy in general, that he kind of broke tradition of previous empires in the way that he treated those who were under his rule by allowing people to go home to have more self-rule. I think one of the key things to take out of this verse then is that Cyrus's policy and the way that it affected particularly the people of Judah wasn't just a historical accident that, it's very nice for them that this is the way it worked under that ruler, but this was actually all happening through the Lord's direction. And as you were very clear and important to bring out, that was for the purposes of ultimately bringing the Messiah into the world about 500 plus years later.
Yeah, this is a great example of what I was trying to get at when I said God isn't working on this front stage of history. He's kind of behind the curtain, if you will. So, Cyrus is on the front stage of history. He's the one who acts. Cyrus isn't a believer in Israel's God. Right? He was a worshiper of the Persian gods. There's no suggestion anywhere in the Bible or outside the Bible that Cyrus ever became a true worshiper of the God of Israel. He may have counted the God of Israel as a god among many gods because he was polytheistic himself. So he may have recognized Israel's God as a god, but he was not in any sense the kind of believer that we think of as, having true faith. But nevertheless, the Lord was working through him, which is what Isaiah 44 and 45 tell us, that God is going to work through Cyrus to raise him up, to give him victories, and then to work through him to restore his people. And God works, through not only the things that are obvious, but also in ways that are hidden from us. And that's what we see here.
Yeah, we get to see what otherwise would have been a hidden way that God works. He reveals to us what he was doing there through Cyrus. It did strike me, as it says, the Lord stirred up Cyrus's spirit. And as you mentioned in Isaiah 44 and 45, there Cyrus is called a Mashiach, a Christ. It struck me that what Cyrus is stirred up to do here is to command the rebuilding of the house of the Lord, which had been the desire of David and was accomplished by Solomon, both of whom were anointed ones. And now here we have another one who's called an anointed one, concerned with the house of the Lord being built. And again, you carry that forward to Jesus, who is the anointed one, who is himself the temple of the Lord. It just struck me that parallelism from the Old into the New Testament.
Yes, the notion that God has called someone and is at work through them is kind of inherent in the idea of being God's anointed. Right? God has anointed them for some reason to perform some function. It's not like getting a promotion at work, just so that you can make more money. Right. When God anoints someone, it's for the purpose of carrying out some task in the kingdom of God. And in this case, Cyrus is not a believer, but God is still using him for that purpose.
Within Cyrus's proclamation, as we have it recorded here in the first couple of verses, Cyrus calls him the Lord. He uses the divine name there. As you said, that doesn't mean that he's got saving faith, but he at least acknowledges him by name. Within the context, he calls him both the God of heaven, but then toward the end, he calls him also the God who is in Jerusalem. And I was curious if you had any comments on those two ways of addressing God. Granted, it comes from Cyrus, but how we might consider that from a Christian perspective.
Right. Well, no, I think I don't think this creates really a problem for us. As I said, Cyrus was polytheistic, so he was probably quite willing to recognize the God of Israel as a God. He is a God of heaven, right? And he acknowledges that God has given him all the kingdoms of the earth, and that's basically what God says he's going to do in Isaiah 45. Now, by the way, it might be useful to know here that what we have in these verses is not the same as what's on the Cyrus cylinder.
Right.
The Cyrus cylinder is a generic description of what Cyrus did, in general terms. Probably, almost certainly, and in light of this text, I think we can say certainly, what actually happened was Cyrus set this policy, and then there were individual decrees drawn up for each people group who were allowed to go back.
Yeah.
This was their legal license, if you will, to return. They could show this to anybody who opposed them along the way and say, no, we're good. King says we can do this. And so that's why the text here does not line up word for word in any way with the Cyrus cylinder, although there are ideas here that line up with the Cyrus cylinder, the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of the vessels, that go with it. Those are things that are specifically mentioned in the Cyrus cylinder. applying to many people, but they're part of what he was doing. So that's why he says he charged me to build him a house. That is to say, this is what Cyrus thought that the gods wanted him to do in general, not just for the Israelites, but for all the suppressed people. He's going to allow them to rebuild temples. And it's going to be in Jerusalem because Cyrus knows or has been informed that this is the place where the temple of Yahweh was built. It's where the Jews would want it to be rebuilt. And that's why he says in verse 3, at the end of verse 3, that Yahweh is the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. Yeah. So he recognizes that Jerusalem is the place where Israel's God dwells. In the temple, where he has chosen for his temple to dwell. And this is really common in the ancient Near East. This is not exceptional. There were, Marduk dwelled in Babylon. Everybody knew that, right? And the gods often had, in the ancient world, while they were not limited to that place, they had specific places that they had chosen to manifest themselves. And that's the place where their major temples were built. So there were other churches, we might say, dedicated to the worship of those gods in other places. Right. But their major temple was built usually in one particular city, although they might have secondary temples in other cities.
Dr. Adams, we have about 4 minutes here, and there's a couple more points I think that are worth bringing out of this text. Again, in the historical context, you covered a lot of what happens. One is the way that Cyrus's decree not only says, let the people of Judah go home from wherever they are, they can go home, but also then the way that the people around them are to provide for the rebuilding of the temple in addition to those. And then the other thing that really stands out is the matter of the vessels that are brought out and brought back, particularly those that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem in the first place. So if you would just talk about those two things, the way that those around the people of Judah are commanded to participate in the rebuilding, and then the vessels that are brought back as a way to help us wrap things up this morning.
Yeah. About the people who did not, who were going to help out. I mentioned that chapter 2 actually gives us numbers of people, and the total, I'm still looking for it here, was 46,000. There it is, 42,360, chapter 2, verse 64. Now, the point is, that was not by any means the majority of the Jews who were living in Babylon. That is to say, the group that returned were a minority. And so what Cyrus is requiring is that those Jews who do not choose to go back to Yehud, they are still part of the community, and they're responsible for what the community is going to do. So they're going to be called upon to support those who do return, because those who return are going to go through tremendous hardship. It's going to take them the better part of a year to walk. They walked back all those hundreds of miles from Babylon to Judah, to Jerusalem. Mostly barefoot, by the way. So people didn't wear shoes most of the time in those days. So they're going to be walking back hundreds of miles. It's going to take them, in order to make the preparations and all that, the better part of a year. And when they get back, they won't have any food. They won't have any houses. They certainly don't have a temple. So they're going to have to rebuild their lives from scratch for the most part. There'll be some houses that they can take over, but so they're going to be very poor when they return. And so what Cyrus is doing is requiring the Israelites who stay behind and are going to be better off financially because they don't go back, right? Cyrus is saying to them, you have a responsibility to help those who are returning, not only build the temple, but also just support them in their return. So that's the main issue there, as far as that's concerned. Now, as to the vessels, this was, again, very common practice in the ancient world, that when a city was conquered, they would carry away all of the vessels in the temple. The temples in the ancient world served to a degree like banks. They were centers of a lot of wealth everywhere in the ancient world. And there are probably, I have to count them, 5 or 6 times in the Old Testament where we're told that in order to meet the demands of conquerors, that they stripped the temple of all of its wealth, and gave it to the Egyptians, or gave it to the army, to the people from Damascus, or gave it to the Assyrians, or gave it to the Babylonians. And so the temple vessels were something that conquering nations always wanted to get. And they would take them back, and sometimes they would be melted down for money. Other times they would be used into worship of the gods. And frankly, putting them in the temples in Babylon, say, is one way more or less of putting them in the bank as well. So because the king can get them if he needs them to melt them down, or if they're conquered and have to pay tribute, they'll have them there. So so the point is, they're returning these to the Judahites, and they'll take them back and use them in the temple to begin the temple worship over again. And we don't know what happened to them, when they actually got back. It may be that they melted some of them down to meet their financial needs. That's a possibility. The text doesn't tell us. But they would have needed them for the temple worship once the temple was rebuilt and rededicated.
All right. So Cyrus thinks of all those things that are necessary. The stage is set for the people of God to begin this journey home. We're going to talk more about that with chapter 2 and following as this series continues. The Reverend Dr. David Adams is professor of exegetical theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. He's been helping us today to study Ezra chapter 1. Dr. Adams, thanks for being our guest today.
It's great to be with you, Pastor Appel.
I am your host here on Sharper Iron, Pastor Timothy Appel of Faith Lutheran Church in Godfrey, Illinois. If you have any questions about Ezra 1, send an email to kfuo@kfuo.org. Please join us tomorrow to take a look at Ezra chapter 2 as we hear the names and numbers of those who returned home in this first wave of exiles coming back. Thanks for spending the morning with us. Talk to you again tomorrow.
Showing support for KFUO is now easier than ever. You can sport a KFUO shirt, swag, or even socks by visiting our online store. Go to kfuo.org/store and order high-quality KFUO-branded merch. You no longer need to wait for our annual share-a-thon for a chance to show your KFUO spirit. Visually share and wear this ministry out in the world by checking out our selection. Every purchase helps to support our proclamation of Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Go to kfuo.org/store.